Now, as I turn back to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, let us remember kind of where we've been recently. At the beginning of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, Solomon describes to us God's orderliness, the structure with which God sovereignly appoints times and seasons in our lives. Every situation, every time, every season that he appoints and permits and allows graciously into our lives, Solomon says in verse 11 of chapter 3 that it is beautiful, it is right, it is orderly, it is according to God's purposes and according to God's plan. The same way in which God created the earth and the galaxies and the universe, the same purpose, the same structure, the same orderliness with which he created the world in which we function is the same manner in which he appoints times and seasons in our lives. Now, we may not understand entirely why God permits certain times and seasons into our lives. In fact, we might even say to ourselves, like Joseph regarding his brothers, you meant it for evil, but we know that God means everything for good. Romans chapter 8 reminds us that everything works for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. And so times and seasons are graciously appointed into our lives, and even though man can interfere and perhaps cast a measure of injustice and wickedness and unrighteousness and evil into our lives, we know that ultimately God is in control. Everything is meant for our good and for his glory, and though others might mean evil towards us, God means it for good. And so we've seen from the first half of chapter 3 that God has appointed seasons and times in our lives, and that he has made everything beautiful. It's all orderly. It's all according to his plan and according to his purpose. And he has an eternal purpose in mind, not just merely a purpose here and now. But yet we saw last week that even though God is sovereign, and that even though God is in control and everything that occurs in our world occurs according to his plan, according to his purposes, and according to his will, and for his honor and for his glory, yet it doesn't change the fact that the world that we live in is broken. It doesn't change the fact that we are fallen beings. And Solomon observes that in reality, what should be the everyday, the normal experience as God intended for us to live in, a world that is rightly ordered by God, Solomon observes that that is hardly the case. Solomon goes into places of where righteousness is to be upheld, and he notices that wicked people are the ones who have been tasked with the responsibility of upholding righteousness. And because they're wicked, he notes that their judgment, their decisions are unjust. And Solomon says, that's the kind of world that it would be better if I had never been born than to live in a world where good is evil and evil is considered good. And so we spoke last week of God's sovereignty in a corrupt world. It's not God who is bad. It's not God who is evil. God is good. He remains good. His purposes are good. Everything is beautiful in its time, but it is man that has corrupted God's goodness in this world. And now we get into chapter 4, and we look at verse 4. And with these tensions in mind, the tension that God has ordered everything according to his purpose and according to his plan and according to his word and his will, and it is beautiful, with the tension that man has corrupted it, how do we live in that kind of world? Should we say like Solomon, it'd be better if I had never been born than to live in a world like that? Well, the very fact that we're here this morning, we can't really say that, can we? We have to function in this world where it seems like evil is considered good and good is considered evil. So how do we do so without becoming discouraged? And so this morning, I'd like to speak on the topic of achieving balance between life's tensions. I'd like to ask us this as we begin. The question is simply this: what do you do when you believe that God is in control, but it doesn't feel like he's intervening? How does that shape the way that you live? How do we function in this world where we as Christians, we believe that God is good, that he's created everything beautiful and allows everything, and it's beautiful in its time, it's beautiful in its place, yet it seems like evil abounds, and God, we're living in that time period between creation and between his return where it seems like God is doing nothing but twiddling his thumbs. What do we do? How do we live? How do we function in that kind of world? And how is that reality shaping the way that we live? Well, it's pretty predictable, and Solomon reveals that to us here in the remaining verses of chapter 4. But how do we function in that kind of world? Do we find ourselves trying to outperform others? Do we push harder or strive faster or grasp for greater security because we don't feel like perhaps that God is doing anything about it right now? Or do we pull away? Do we just kind of put our head in the sand and kind of isolate ourselves from people and from problems and just kind of hope that they just all go away and work out in the end, and that we can try to avoid perhaps being affected by the problems that we see in our world? Or do we grasp for control and recognition? Do we hope that if people notice us, that our lives will feel as if they're more stable, and that we can exercise a greater sense of control in our ever-changing and increasingly corrupt environment? And so Solomon, he kind of predicts that that's the way that people tend to respond in a world where tension exists between God's sovereignty and man's corruption, yet God is doing nothing about it. People will either tend to try to take control of things and situations and matters in their own lives. They'll tend to try to take matters into their own hands, or they'll just completely self-isolate from people and from problems. But you'll notice here in these verses 4 through 16, that Solomon uses a phrase 3 times, and this passage can really be divided into 3 equal parts based on these 2 words that Solomon uses. Solomon uses the words better than. So Solomon, he predicts, the way that human nature naturally responds to that tension. He points that out, but then he shows us a better way. Instead of responding to this tension in a way where we're grasping for control or just putting our head in the sand, Solomon says there's a better way to live in this tension. And he shows us 3 ways. He says first that contentment is better. He shows us, secondly, that community is better. And he shows us, thirdly, that humility is better. And so I'd like for us to examine these 3 better ways, these 3 wise paths that keep us from replacing trust in God during these trying times with extremes, whether that is grasping for control or burying our heads in the sand. The first better way that Solomon reveals to us is found in verses 4 through 6. Solomon says, better is contentment than grasping or giving up. There in verse number 4, Solomon, he leaves the halls of justice, and perhaps he walks down the street and he observes those who are working. And he says, again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity. It's empty. It's meaningless. It's futile. And it's grasping for the wind. So Solomon, he begins pointing out the problem. Verse number 5. The fool, on the other hand, he folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. And in verse 6, Solomon offers the better way. He says, better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Here in verses 4 through 6, when Solomon speaks that contentment is better than grasping or giving up, Solomon is making reference or using the illustration of work. Solomon begins with our work or our motivations for work because how we work often reveals what we trust. Do we trust in our own ability to make things right? Do we trust in our own ingenuity to make sense of the world around us, make sense of the problems we encounter? Or do we rest in God and in his sovereignty and that he makes everything beautiful in its time? So Solomon points out two extremes that are contrary to living a contented kind of life. He points out, first of all, in verse 4, the extreme of competitive living. He observes that every right work is often driven by envy or by jealousy. Even labor, even work that is good and that is honest, when it is fueled by comparison, can become vain or futile. And now when God's justice, as he observed in the previous verses, feels slow or feels like it's not going to come, we are tempted to take control and work things out for God. And so in our relationship with others, instead of perhaps trusting God, that God is going to work things out or that God is going to provide for us or meet our needs, because obviously in the preceding verses, the courts wouldn't do it. Rather than trusting that God is going to meet our needs, we then turn to competitiveness, to one-upmanship, to gamesmanship, and this diligence of working. It becomes a matter of rivalry with others. And so Solomon here, he says that one extreme that we fall into between the tension of God's orderliness and the corruption that we live in is that we begin to take matters into our own hands through our labor, through our work. He shows us also the opposite extreme. He shows us that the other response is through laziness. Solomon warns against the opposite extreme. He talks about a fool who folds his hands and just simply consumes himself, does nothing. Here's a person who lives in the tension, he sees the problem, and he refuses to do anything about it. Whereas on the other hand, the diligent worker, he wants to do something about it, but he falls into the trap of becoming competitive or judging his worth or judging his value or judging his success based upon how he outperforms others rather than on faithfulness to God. Here on the opposite hand, this other individual will just bury his head in the sand. Burying one's head in the sand is not the same as waiting on God or trusting, because waiting on God is never considered to be a passive act. When Scripture says that we wait on the Lord or that we hope in God, it always contains an element of expectation. We don't just wait passively for God to do something, but we wait with an expectation. And that expectation fuels our motives, fuels our actions, fuels our desires, and fuels our work. And so Solomon, he talks about two extremes of individuals here. One who tries to take things into their own hands and falls into the eventual trap of competing with others rather than relying on God. And then he also talks about the other extreme, the one who simply buries his head in the sand and not trusting God. And both extremes come from the same root. Both extremes reveal a distrust in God's ordering of life. On one hand, the diligent worker takes matters into his own hands. On the other hand, the lazy individual doesn't trust God at all and just tries to get away from it. But Solomon offers a better way. He offers us this. In verse number 6, he says, "Better is a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind." He says the better way is to be content. To be content with what God has given us. To be content with God's timing. To be content with the season of life that God has currently placed us in. It might not be what we would have chosen for ourselves. It might not be desirable. But we should trust God in that season because it is beautiful in its time. It is ordered by God, and it's the safest place to be. It's exactly where God wants us to be in that moment. And so Solomon says, better is a handful with quietness. The word quietness there describes a settled heart. Here Solomon is describing not one who is lazy, not one who is a workaholic, but rather one who goes about the business that God has given him to complete. And he works at it diligently, yet he trusts God for the result. He trusts God for the right outcome. Modern day parable of that might be this. There was a type A corporate attorney who happened to see a fisherman who he knew from church one afternoon. The fisherman's legs were dangling off the edge of the pier, and the fisherman was simply watching his children there on the rocky shore look for crabs underneath the rocks. Well, the type A corporate attorney, he goes up to the fisherman and he says, "Hey, shouldn't you be fishing right now?" And the fisherman said, "No, why should I be?" He said, "Well, if you were fishing right now while your kids were looking for crabs, you could be making more money. You could be catching more fish." And he said, "Well, why would I want to catch more fish? Why would I want to make more money?" The attorney said to the fisherman, "Well, so then that you could buy more boats and catch more fish and make more money." The fisherman looked up at the attorney again. He said, "Well, then what would I do then at that point?" The attorney said, "Well, then you could be like me and you would have time to just enjoy life." And the fisherman said, "What do you think I'm doing right now?" And so there is a balance here that Solomon is instructing us to achieve, to seek out. The answer is not to respond to the tensions in life that we face by overworking ourselves or overburdening ourselves, nor is it to bury our heads in the sand, so to speak. But rather it is to trust that what God has given us is good enough, and the rest in his promise that he'll take care of the outcomes. And so Solomon here, in this tension, he says it's better to be content than to have both hands full. It's better to have just one handful if it's filled with quietness and contentedness and peace than it is to always be striving to get that peace. And so there is a balance here that Solomon encourages us to strike. Secondly, Solomon tells us in verses 7 through 12 that community is better than isolation. There in verse number 7, Solomon, he returns and he says, I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother. Yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So Solomon now turns from our work to our relationships. Not because relationships will fix everything, but because isolation makes things heavier. So Solomon says that in this tension where it seems like God is not intervening in a world that is corrupt, some will strive for control and work harder. Solomon also says that some will resort to the opposite and begin to isolate themselves from people. And Solomon warns us about that. He says, better is it to be in community with others than to be isolated from them. We see in verses 7 through 8 the extreme of self-sufficient isolation. He says there that there is one alone without a companion. He has neither son nor brother, but yet there is no end to his labors. Solomon here, he observes another vanity, another way that life is lived without God under the sun. He says, a man who is completely alone, has no companion, has no brother, yet he still finds that there is no end to his toil, to his labor, to his pursuits. This individual has perhaps possessions, but he doesn't have relationships or people. He has achievement, but he has no affection for others or from others. This individual has perhaps a full garage, a full barn, but he has an empty life on the inside. There's something missing. And despite all this material gain, to make it worse, Solomon says, his eye is never satisfied. His eye is never satisfied with riches. And so when he looks around at all that he has, he realizes that everything that he owns, everything that he possesses, everything that he works for, without relationships, without people, only deepens his misery. He has all these goods, all this fun stuff, but no one to share it with, no one to experience it with, no one to encourage with it. And so there is this extreme of self-sufficient isolation. This man, Solomon says, never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This isn't just a question regarding his social status, but this is a theological question. This is a man who never asks, am I being a good steward of what God has given me? This is a man who never questions, am I working for the Lord? Am I working for his honor, for his glory? Am I working for myself? And so in the tension of life, we can be caught up in the trap here, Solomon says, of simply taking so much control that we isolate ourselves from others and just focus completely on our possessions. Because our possessions, in a sense, we might believe, replace the pain that we feel. But Solomon says that there is a better way, and that is to live a shared life. In verses 9 through 12, Solomon begins to show how a shared life lived with others in community is better. Solomon, against that emptiness, he offers a simple and powerful principle. He says that two are better than one. He says two are better than one, not because it's impossible to live alone or that we cannot live alone, but he says that two are better than one because God never designed for us to thrive alone apart from him. God always intended life to be lived in community. We can go back to Genesis chapter 1. Adam was lonely, alone. What did God do for him? He provided a meat. He provided a help that was meat for him. Although Solomon is not thinking of the church here in this passage of Ecclesiastes chapter 4, we see that this passage, although it doesn't have the local church community in view, we find that the fullest expression of this principle, that two are better than one, that life is better lived in community, finds its fullest expression in the local church. And so Solomon, he shows us a better way. We can be better productive together. He says two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. He also says in verse 10 that two are better than one because two can provide better help in trouble. He also speaks of in verses 11 and 12 that two are better than one because the strength is stronger in hardship and attack. And so we think of this in the context that two are better than one because they're stronger together. But I also want us to think of this in another way. I also want us to think, because he's comparing two are better than one to a man who is living in isolation. And this man who lives in isolation and who is working for himself and who is living for himself and who is pursuing various things for himself, this man never finds himself satisfied or contented. And Solomon raises the point that he never asks who he will, who does he toil for, and why does he deprive himself of good? He never asks those questions. But he implies that this is vanity. He's implying that his response is based upon the vanity of what he's doing. What he's saying is that the one who is isolated, who is only living for himself, who is only living for possessions, he's saying that kind of life is vain and that kind of work is vain, and therefore it's futile. Therefore it's, you could say, meaningless. So another way to look at this passage where it says that two are better than one is not just merely in terms of strength in numbers, but in terms of meaning, in terms of value, in terms of vanity. Those things that are really important in life, those things which we should prioritize, many times they require more help. They require more people to be involved because we can make a greater impact for good. And so Solomon, he says the better way is to not invest in yourself, not invest in your possessions, but to invest in those things that are really important, those things that really matter for eternity. And so many times others will be involved alongside us in those pursuits. And so Solomon, he is promoting community, but we also must note that community is not codependency. Now, what's the difference between community and codependency? Aren't they both kind of a shared life? They are, and that certainly is true. But codependency and community differ in one key way. In codependent relationships, we are dependent upon one another for success in a pursuit, so to speak. You can think of a football team and of football players. 11 men on defense, 11 men on offense, 11 work together on one side. They are codependent on each other. Each individual plays a part in helping that particular play to succeed. Perhaps an offensive lineman is going to block for a runner. Well, the offensive lineman, he has to make his blocks. He has to kind of prepare a way for the running back to run through and to get through that hole. So in a sense, the running back is dependent upon the offensive lineman to do their job. And there's just so many ways, so many schemes. Other players might be running into backfield to try to throw the defense off. Perhaps there's a pass and timing is critical, and the quarterback depends on the receiver being exactly where he said he was going to be during practice. And so in a sense, they're all codependent on each other for success. But here's the difference between that, codependency, and community. If those players don't run the play that the coach has called, then that play is going to be a mess. Perhaps the result is going to be a turnover, perhaps an interception. Community is like codependence, but community relies not just merely on each other, but first it relies in trust in God. With God as our coach, so to speak, we trust that God is calling the right plays, that he has appointed everything rightly for our good in his manner and in his timing. And we trust him. And so that's where community comes in. Community is believers working together, trusting God. And so Solomon, he shows us a better way. He says that contentment is better. He shows us that community is better. And then thirdly and finally, what undergirds all this? It's humility. Solomon says that humility is better than ambition. There in verse number 13, Solomon says, "Better as a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in his kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind." And so Solomon here, another way, a predictable way that people will respond to the fact that it doesn't seem like God is intervening in a world that has become messy. He addresses that people sometimes become overly ambitious. They become entitled and self-important there in verse 13. Verses 14 through 16, Solomon goes on to show us that achievement and fame, perhaps what we receive because we feel entitled to, that it's futile, that it's fleeting, that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. But Solomon says that there is a better way. There in verse number 13, he says that it is better to be poor and wise. It's better to be humble. Wisdom doesn't lie in our achievement or in our status, but it lies in remaining teachable. It lies in being willing to serve, and it lies in being willing to trust God with the outcomes. And so this is the tension we find ourselves living in. That God is in control. He sovereignly appointed everything according to his purposes, and it's beautiful. But yet the world we live in, it seems like God is not doing anything. And so this tension, it's not going to disappear. It's a tension that we can't just escape from. We have to live in it. But Solomon here, he advises us that contentment is better in those situations. He advises us that living in community is better. And he advises us that being teachable, being humble is better. And so this morning we live between these extremes, and we should live wisely. And we should trust that God, who ordered the times, will in his time set everything right.